The dusty road that winds its way toward the main gate of the ranch in Pearsall, Texas, does not look like a path to royalty, but to anyone who knows the soul of country music, it is the driveway to the castle of the king. It is a stretch of gravel and dirt that has memorized the tires of 1,000 pickup trucks and felt the weight of seasons changing from the blistering heat of July to the crisp, biting chill of December. Dust motes dance in the late afternoon amber light, creating a haze that looks like a faded photograph come to life. This road is the border between the noise of the world and the silence of the man who conquered it. Inside the main house, the silence was a warm, living thing. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the comfortable quiet of two people who have said everything there is to say and found peace in the mere presence of the other. George Strait stood by the large bay window, looking out at that dusty road where the winter frost was beginning to settle on the fence posts. He held a mug of black coffee in a hand that had strummed 1,000,000 chords and shaken 1,000,000 other hands, yet today, that hand was steady and still. At 71 years old, the lines on his face were like the tracks on a vinyl record, each one holding a story, a song, or a secret. Behind him in the living room that smelled of cedar wood and cinnamon, Norma was adjusting the ornaments on the Christmas tree. It was a ritual they performed every year with a religious dedication. No staff, no decorators, just George and Norma. She hummed a melody that wasn't one of his hits, but an old hymn they used to sing in church back when gas cost pennies and dreams were free. George turned from the window and watched her. After 50 years of marriage, she was still the only audience that ever truly mattered. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, popping loudly and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The tranquility of the afternoon was shattered, not by a gunshot, but by the shrill mechanical ring of the landline on the heavy oak desk in George's study. He frowned. Few people had that number, and fewer still dared to call during the sacred week before Christmas. He walked slowly to the study, his boots making a dull rhythmic thud against the hardwood floor. He picked up the receiver. It was his attorney, a man named Robert, who usually spoke with the measured cadence of a judge, but today his voice was trembling, vibrating with a panic that George could feel through the wire. Robert explained that a digital media conglomerate based in New York City known as Clickstream had acquired a physical asset in a blind auction of storage units in San Antonio. It was a box of personal effects that had gone missing during the chaotic move the Straits made in the early 80s. Inside the box, among tax returns and old receipts, was a single VHS tape labeled simply December 24, 1982. George felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the Texas winter. He knew that date. He knew that tape. He sat down heavily in the leather chair, his eyes fixing on a point in the distance that didn't exist. That was the year they had nothing. That was the year the music industry had almost broken him before he even started. That was the year he almost quit. Robert continued speaking rapidly about cease and desist orders and injunctions, but George was no longer listening to the legal jargon. He was listening to the threat. Clickstream had sent a teaser to the press. They were framing the video as the breakdown of the king. They were claiming it showed a drunk, desperate George Strait screaming at his wife on Christmas Eve, evidence of a marriage on the rocks and a man unfit for the pedestal the world had placed him on. They planned to release the full edited footage tomorrow at noon, unless George came to the table. George hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He sat there for a long time. The winter sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid of how the truth could be twisted until it looked like a lie. That tape contained the most vulnerable moment of his life, a moment of prayer and desperation that belonged only to him and Norma. To sell it as a scandal was a violation of the soul. He walked back into the living room. Norma looked up, her smile fading instantly as she read the storm clouds gathering in his eyes. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply walked over and took his hand, her fingers calloused and warm. He told her everything. He told her about the tape. He told her about the company in New York. He told her they wanted to turn their sacred memory into a circus-side show. Norma listened, her face unreadable, until he finished. Then she squeezed his hand. She reminded him that the truth is like a lion, and you don't have to defend it, you just have to let it loose. But she also saw the fire in his eyes, the protective instinct of a cowboy whose homestead is under attack. George went to the closet and pulled out his travel bag. He didn't pack a suit. He packed his best pressed Wranglers, a clean white shirt that was starched stiff enough to stand on its own, and his black jacket. He took his black felt hat off the rack and brushed the brim with a slow, deliberate motion. He wasn't going to New York as a celebrity. He was going as a husband. He kissed Norma on the forehead, a lingering kiss that promised he would return with their honor intact. The drive to the airport was a blur of asphalt and headlights. The private jet that awaited him was a luxury he rarely indulged in for vanity. But today, it was a tool of war. As the plane ascended, leaving the sprawling lights of Texas behind, George looked out at the darkness. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to 1982. He remembered the smell of that small rental house, the drafty windows, the tree that was barely 2 feet tall sitting on a crate because they couldn't afford a stand. He remembered the crushing weight of failure pressing down on his young shoulders and the way Norma had looked at him, not with pity, but with a belief so fierce it terrified him. New York City was a different planet. The plane landed in a slurry of grey slush and biting wind that cut through clothes like a knife. The city didn't sleep, and it didn't care. It was a machine of noise and ambition. George moved through the terminal like a ghost. People turned their heads, sensing someone of importance, but the cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes deterred them from approaching. He didn't have security guards flanking him. He walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man who knows exactly where he is going. The headquarters of Clickstream was a glass monolith in Midtown Manhattan. It was a building designed to intimidate, a structure of steel and cold reflection that seemed to look down on the humanity scurrying at its feet. George walked into the lobby, his boots clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. The sound was alien here, distinct from the soft shuffle of sneakers and dress shoes. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset, looked up and froze. She didn't need to ask for a name. The silhouette was iconic. He was escorted up 40 floors in an elevator that moved so fast it made his ears pop. The doors opened to a sprawling open-plan office that buzzed with the frenetic energy of a beehive. Dozens of young people sat glued to screens, analyzing data, chasing trends, manufacturing outrage for clicks. They stopped typing as George Strait walked past. A hush fell over the room. It was the silence of predators realizing a lion had walked into the den. He was led to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the empire of concrete. Behind a desk that cost more than George's first truck sat Julian. The CEO of Clickstream was a man in his 30s with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a suit that was too tight. He stood up, extending a hand that was soft and manicured. George looked at the hand, then looked at Julian's face. He didn't shake it. He just sat down in the chair opposite the desk and placed his hat on his knee. Julian retracted his hand without losing his composure. He tapped the surface of a sleek tablet and slid it across the desk toward George. On the screen, the paused image of a grainy VHS tape was visible. It was the living room of 1982. Julian leaned back, steepling his fingers. He began to speak with the arrogant confidence of a man who believes he holds all the aces. He told George that the world loves a fallen hero. He explained that their data showed that negative engagement was 3 times more profitable than positive stories. He said they had already prepared the narrative. Julian pressed play. The video was a masterpiece of manipulation. It showed a young George Strait face, red with emotion, pacing the room. The audio had been enhanced to make his passionate singing voice sound like shouting. The camera jerked wildly. Then it cut to Norma, wiping tears from her face. Taken out of context, it looked like a domestic dispute, a scene of anger and misery. The video stopped. Julian smiled. He told George that for $10 million, they would bury the tape. If not, it would go live to 200 million subscribers at noon the next day. George looked at the tablet, then he looked out the window at the grey sky. He thought about the dusty road back in Pearsall. He thought about the silence of his home. He looked back at Julian, and for the first time since entering the building, he spoke. His voice was low, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate the glass walls of the office. He asked Julian if he had ever been hungry. Not the hunger of missing lunch, but the hunger of not knowing if you could feed the person you love. Julian blinked, confused by the question. He started to stammer something about market value and brand protection. George stood up. He picked up his hat and placed it carefully on his head. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. He looked at Julian with the pity one might feel for a creature that has never seen the sun. He told the executive that there are things in this world that cannot be bought and memories that cannot be sold. He said that Julian had made a mistake. He hadn't found a scandal. He had found a prayer. And tomorrow, George wasn't going to hide from it. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the tablet on the desk. Julian shouted after him, asking if that was a yes or a no, asking if he realized what this would do to his legacy. George didn't turn around. He walked back through the hive of workers who were now whispering frantically. He stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, he saw Julian frantically typing on his phone. Back on the street, the cold air hit him, but this time it felt bracing. He hailed a cab not to the airport but to the hotel where his team had set up a command center. He sat in the back of the cab, watching the lights of Broadway blur. He felt a strange sense of calm. The fight was on. They wanted to show the world a video. Fine. He would show the world the video, but he would make sure they saw the whole thing. He took out his phone and dialed his publicist. He told her to cancel the lawyers. He told her to get him a slot on the biggest morning show in the country. He was going to go live. The snow began to fall harder, covering the grime of the city in a blanket of white. It reminded him of the cotton fields of Texas. He closed his eyes and let the memory of 1982 wash over him fully this time. He needed to remember every detail. He needed to remember the despair so he could explain the redemption. He needed to summon the ghost of the young man he used to be to save the old man he had become. The cab driver glanced in the rearview mirror and asked if he was okay. George opened his eyes and smiled, a genuine warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He said he was better than okay, he was ready. The hotel room on the 35th floor of the Mandarin Oriental was a cage of silk and velvet. It was luxurious in the way that money can buy comfort but cannot buy soul. George Strait sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, staring at the city skyline through the panoramic window. The lights of New York blinked incessantly, a restless galaxy of ambition and insomnia. He felt 1,000,000 miles away from the quiet stars that hung over Pearsall. Here the silence was artificial, insulated by triple-paned glass that kept the screaming sirens at a dull hum. He looked at his hands. They were older now, weathered by time and work, but in the reflection of the glass, he saw the hands of the young man from 1982. He picked up the hotel phone, bypassing his cell phone, because he wanted to hear the clear, uncompressed sound of her voice without the digital interference. He dialed the number he had known by heart for half a century. It rang twice. Norma answered, and the sound of her voice was like a warm blanket on a freezing night. She didn't say hello, she just said his name. George closed his eyes. He told her about the meeting with Julian. He told her about the cold, sterile office and the soulless eyes of the man who wanted to sell their pain for profit. He told her they were going to release the video at noon, regardless of what he did, unless he played their game. But he also told her he had chosen a different game. There was a pause on the line. George could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace back home. He apologized. He told her he was sorry that the life he chose, the music and the road and the lights, had finally come back to intrude on the one thing he swore to protect. He felt the weight of guilt heavy and suffocating. He was the king of country, but in that moment he felt like a husband who had left the front door unlocked. Norma's voice became firm. She told him to stop. She reminded him of that Christmas Eve. She asked him if he remembered what she said to him when he put the guitar down that night. George swallowed hard, the lump in his throat, tasting of bitter memory. He said he remembered. She told him that the truth doesn't rot. It waits. She told him to go into that studio and not to fight with anger, but to fight with the heart he showed her that night. She told him she loved him, and then the line went dead, leaving him alone with the hum of the city. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in the armchair and let the memory of 1982 take him completely. The flashback was visceral. It wasn't just images, it was temperature and smell. It was December 24th, 1982. The rental house in San Marcos was freezing because they were trying to save money on heating oil. The walls were thin, and the wind rattled the window frames. George was 30 years old, but he felt 100. Nashville had been a series of closed doors. The executives told him he was too traditional, that the world wanted pop country, that his hat was too big, and his voice was too old-fashioned. He had come home defeated. In the memory, George saw himself sitting on the floor. They had no money for gifts, not a dime. All they had was a small tree they had cut down from a ditch on the side of the road. It was sparse and leaning to the left. Norma was in the kitchen trying to make a Christmas dinner out of canned beans and cornbread. George had picked up his guitar. It was a cheap acoustic with strings that needed changing. He began to play, not to perform, but to bleed. He was angry at God. He was angry at the industry. He was terrified that he had dragged his wife into a life of poverty for a dream that was dying. The song he played wasn't on any album. It was a raw, unpolished melody of frustration. He was singing loudly, his voice cracking, straining against the silence of the house. He was crying. Tears of rage and exhaustion ran down his face. In the video, Clickstream had, "This looked like a man screaming at his wife." But in the memory, George saw Norma walk into the room. She didn't look scared. She looked at him with a profound sadness and an even deeper love. She sat down next to him on the floor. She put her hand on the neck of the guitar, stopping the music. She wiped the tears from his face with her thumb. That was the moment. That was the pivot point of his entire life. If she had told him to quit, he would have sold the guitar the next day and taken a job at the cattle pens. But she didn't. She told him that they didn't need money for Christmas. She told him that his voice was the only gift she ever wanted. She told him to sing it again, but this time to sing it for her, not for the record labels. George opened his eyes in the hotel room. The sun was rising over Manhattan, painting the skyscrapers in hues of cold steel and blood orange. He stood up. The guilt was gone, replaced by a cold resolve. He showered, shaved, and put on his best white shirt. He tied his tie with slow, deliberate movements. He put on his hat, checking the brim in the mirror. He wasn't George Strait, the icon, today. He was the man from the floor of that rental house. A black SUV waited for him downstairs. The ride to the television studio was short. The city was waking up, trash trucks grinding gears and commuters rushing with heads down against the wind. The studio was located in Times Square, a frantic epicenter of screens and lights. As George stepped out of the car, the paparazzi were already there, alerted by the rumors Clickstream had leaked. Flashes popped like lightning, blinding and aggressive. George didn't stop. He tipped his hat slightly and walked through the glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was chaotic. Producers with headsets ran back and forth carrying clipboards and coffee. The air smelled of hairspray and ozone. George was ushered into a green room. It was small and filled with a fruit basket that looked plastic. A young producer named Sarah entered, looking nervous. She told him that the segment was scheduled for the top of the hour. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. She told him that Julian from Clickstream was also there. He had been invited as a counterpoint to discuss celebrity transparency. It was a trap, a televised ambush. George nodded slowly. He didn't demand Julian be removed. He didn't call his lawyer. He simply asked Sarah if he could have a guitar. Just a standard acoustic guitar. Sarah looked confused. She explained that this was a talk segment, not a performance slot. George looked at her with eyes that were gentle but unyielding. He said he understood, but he would feel more comfortable with it in his hands. Sarah scrambled to find one. 10 minutes before airtime, George was led to the wings of the stage. He could hear the audience clapping on the other side of the curtain. He could hear the host, a man named Brad, whose voice was smooth and practiced, teasing the upcoming segment. Coming up next, the king of country in a scandal that might dethrone him. We have the exclusive footage. Stay tuned. George stood in the shadows. To his left, he saw Julian. The CEO was wearing a fresh suit and had a makeup artist dabbing powder on his forehead. Julian saw George and smirked. He walked over, invading George's personal space. He whispered that it wasn't too late to write a check. He said that once the video played, George's image as the perfect family man would be shattered. He said the internet doesn't forgive. George looked down at Julian. He adjusted his grip on the borrowed guitar. He spoke softly so only Julian could hear. He said that the internet might not forgive, but the truth doesn't need forgiveness. He told Julian that he was about to learn the difference between price and value. The stage manager counted down. 3, 2, 1. The music swelled. The audience cheered, but the applause was tentative, laced with the tension of the promised scandal. George walked out. The lights were incredibly bright hot against his skin. He sat in the chair opposite Brad. Julian sat in the chair next to him, looking smug and relaxed. Brad didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned in his face, a mask of concern that barely hid his hunger for ratings. He asked George about the tape. He asked if it was true that his marriage had been volatile in the early years. He asked if the pressure of failure had caused him to lash out at Norma. Before George could answer, Julian interjected. He spoke smoothly, addressing the camera. He said that Clickstream believed in the truth. He said that the video they found showed a disturbing side of a national icon. He claimed it was important to deconstruct our heroes to see their flaws. He signaled to the control room. "Let's roll the clip," Julian said. The giant screen behind them flickered to life. It was the edited version. The same one George had seen in the office. It showed the grainy footage of 1982. It showed George, red-faced, mouth open wide, appearing to scream. The audio was garbled and harsh. It showed him slamming his hand against the guitar. Then a jagged jump cut to Norma, wiping her eyes, looking devastated. The clip ended. The studio audience gasped. The silence that followed was heavy and judgmental. Brad looked at George, his eyebrows raised, waiting for a denial or an apology. Julian leaned back, crossing his legs, looking like a cat that had just swallowed a canary. George sat perfectly still. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the audience. He looked at the real people sitting in the dark beyond the lights. He saw judgment, but he also saw confusion. They wanted to believe in him, but the evidence was right there in front of them. Brad pressed him. "George, what do you have to say to that?" That didn't look like a silent night. George leaned forward toward the microphone. He took a breath. He didn't defend himself. He didn't attack Julian. He simply asked a question. He asked if they could play the tape again. But this time, he asked them to play the raw audio. The audio that Clickstream had stripped away to make the shouting sound like anger instead of singing. Julian stiffened. He tried to interrupt, saying that the audio quality was poor and they had enhanced it for clarity. George turned to Julian. His eyes were hard now. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small cassette tape. It was old, the plastic yellowed with age. It was the master audio recording from that night. Norma had kept it. She had recorded the song on a small tape deck because she wanted to remember the melody. George held the tape up. The light caught the plastic case. He told the audience that a video without sound is just a picture, but a song without truth is just noise. He handed the tape to the stunned stage manager. He told them to sync it. He told them to play the video again, but this time to let the world hear what he was actually saying. Julian stood up, protesting. He said this was unverified material. He said this was a stunt. But the audience began to murmur. Someone shouted, "Let him play it." Then another. The producer in the booth made a call. The ratings were spiking. They took the tape. George picked up the guitar he had requested. He rested it on his knee. He waited. The studio was electric with tension. The screen flickered again. The date appeared. December 24th, 1982. George looked at the camera. He wasn't looking at the lens, he was looking through it. He was looking at Norma back in Texas, sitting in her chair, holding her breath. "Play it," he said. The control room was a hive of panicked activity, but on the studio floor time seemed to suspend itself. The audio technician, a young man in a hoodie with trembling hands, slotted the yellowed cassette into a deck that hadn't been used in a decade. He fed the output into the main board, syncing it manually with the video feed on the giant screen. Julian sat on the edge of his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. He looked like a man watching a fuse burn down toward a pile of dynamite he was sitting on. Brad, the host, leaned forward, his producer instinct telling him that television history was about to be made. The screen flickered. The video of 1982 restarted. At first there was only the hiss of magnetic tape, a sound like rain on a tin roof. Then the voice cut through. It wasn't the distorted screaming of the edited clip. It was a voice trembling with a vulnerability that broke the heart. "I'm sorry, Norma," the young George on the screen said. His voice was thick with tears. "I'm so sorry. I promised you a house. I promised you a life. And all I've got is this guitar and empty pockets. I'm failing you." The audience in the studio went deathly silent. On screen, the young George slammed his hand against the guitar body, not in aggression but in despair. The sound rang out a dull wooden thud. "I should sell it," the young George continued, his voice cracking. "I should sell the guitar and buy you a proper coat. I'm done with the music. It's taking too much from us." Then came the moment Clickstream had cut. Norma walked into the frame. She didn't flinch. She knelt beside him. Her voice on the tape was clear, soft, and filled with a steel-spined resolve. "You listen to me, George Strait," she said. "We don't need a coat, and we don't need a house. Not if it costs you your soul. You are not selling that guitar. You are going to play it. You are going to sing. Not for them, for us. Sing the prayer, George. Just sing the prayer." On the screen, the young George took a deep, shuddering breath. He wiped his face. He strummed a chord. It was a G major, resonant and pure. He began to sing. It wasn't a country hit. It was an old gospel tune, stripped of all pretension. He sang with his eyes closed, tears streaming down his cheeks. It was a performance of such raw, naked honesty that it felt intrusive to watch. It wasn't a fight. It was a communion. In the studio, the impact was physical. People in the audience were openly weeping. The narrative that Julian had constructed, the angry, abusive husband, evaporated, instantly replaced by the reality of a young couple clinging to each other in the face of a cold, hard world. The tape ended with the sound of the two of them embracing Norma, whispering, "Merry Christmas, Cowboy," before the static took over. The screen went black. For 10 seconds, there was no sound in the studio. No applause, no commentary. Just the collective exhale of a truth revealed. George sat in his chair, his face impassive, but his eyes shining. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at Julian. Julian was pale. He looked at his phone, which was lighting up incessantly on his lap. The social media feed wasn't outraged at George. It was furious at Clickstream. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur. The real king. True love. Shame on Clickstream. Julian had tried to sell a scandal, and instead he had accidentally canonized a saint. George shifted the guitar on his knee. He didn't wait for Brad to ask a question. He simply placed his fingers on the fretboard. The sound of the live acoustic guitar in the studio was crisp and bright, cutting through the heavy emotional atmosphere. "That was 40 years ago," George said, his voice low and steady into the microphone. "We didn't have money for heating oil that night, but we had something better. We had the truth." He looked directly at the camera, addressing the millions watching at home. "There are folks out there right now trying to turn your memories into merchandise. They want you to believe that everything is for sale, that your privacy has a price tag, that your mistakes define you." He strummed a chord, the same G major from the tape, bridging 4 decades in a single second. But they're wrong. The only things that matter are the things you can't buy. And the only legacy worth leaving is the love you protect when the cameras aren't rolling. He began to play. He didn't play a hit song. He played the rest of the song from the tape, the one he hadn't finished in 1982. He played it with the weathered voice of a grandfather, the voice of a man who had won the war. The performance was short, simple, and perfect. When he finished, he placed his hand over the strings, silencing the guitar. Brad wiped a tear from his eye, ignoring his earpiece, where the director was screaming for a commercial break. He looked at Julian. "I think," Brad said, his voice tight, "that we owe Mr. Strait an apology." Julian opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to salvage some scrap of his dignity, to spin the narrative one last time. But he looked at the audience. He saw the hostility in their eyes. He realized he had become the villain in a story he thought he was writing. He closed his mouth, picked up his tablet, and stood up. He walked off the set, his footsteps echoing in the silence, a small man leaving a room filled with giants. George stood up. He shook Brad's hand. He didn't wave to the crowd. He just tipped his hat one slow, respectful motion and walked off the stage. Outside the studio, the snow had stopped. The air was crisp and clean. George got into the waiting car. He didn't check the news. He didn't care about the trending topics or the apologies that were already being issued by the network. He just told the driver one word. Airport. The flight back to Texas was quiet. George slept. He slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who has carried a heavy load and finally set it down. When the plane touched down in San Antonio, the sun was setting the sky on fire with streaks of purple and gold. The drive to Pearsall was the final leg of the journey. As the SUV turned onto the dusty road leading to the ranch, George rolled down the window. The smell of the city was gone, replaced by the scent of sagebrush, damp earth, and cattle. The fence posts flew by like old friends. When he pulled up to the main house, the porch light was on. It was a beacon in the vast Texas darkness. Norma was standing on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She didn't say a word as he climbed out of the car. She just opened the door. George walked up the steps. He dropped his bag. He took off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door. He walked to her and took her in his arms. It wasn't the desperate cling of 1982. It was the solid, enduring embrace of 2023. They stood there for a long time, swaying slightly to a music that only they could hear. "You did good," she whispered. "We did good," he corrected. Inside, the fire was still crackling. The tree was still there. The ornament she had been adjusting when the phone rang was hanging perfectly straight. In the days that followed, the world changed in a small but significant way. The straight effect became a phenomenon. People started posting videos, not of influencers or stunts, but of quiet moments. Grainy videos of grandparents singing, audio tapes of parents reading bedtime stories. The clickstream stock plummeted, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that for a brief moment, the noise of the digital age had been silenced by the authenticity of an analog memory. On Christmas Eve, George and Norma sat on the same leather sofa. The television was off. The phones were unplugged. The only light came from the fireplace and the tree. George picked up his guitar. He didn't play for an audience of millions. He played for an audience of one. He looked at Norma, the light dancing in her eyes, reflecting the years, the struggles, and the victories. He realized that the video hadn't been a curse. It had been a reminder. It reminded the world that the king of country wasn't royalty because of his records. He was royalty because he knew what was worth fighting for. George stopped playing. He looked out the window at the stars hanging high and bright over the Texas plains. "Merry Christmas, Norma," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, cowboy," she replied. The camera pulls back slowly through the window, retreating into the night, leaving them in the sanctuary of their privacy. The house becomes a small, warm glow in the vast landscape of the ranch. The dusty road stretches out under the moonlight, silent and guarding the way to the only place that ever really mattered. The wind blows gently through the mesquite trees, carrying the faint echo of a guitar chord that never really fades away.